Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. If the sound of rain helps you shut down and drift into sleep, then you've found your sanctuary here, a place where darkness meets calm. And if this blend of deep horror and a calming storm helps you find that inner quiet, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe for more long, rainy nights. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now, let the rain wash your worries away, breathe in the silence of the storm. Let's begin the journey. Story 1. Working as a night train dispatcher in the desolate, mountainous stretch of the Pacific Northwest is one of the loneliest jobs in the world. You're entirely alone, sealed in a small, ancient, rattling steel tower, elevated 40 feet high, overlooking two sets of cold, wet, perpetually dark railway lines, the lifelines of massive, endless cargo passing 24 hours a day between Seattle and Missoula. The entire world below my base was a shroud of total, high-velocity sea fog, driven in huge, fast-moving, aggressive banks up from the cold Columbia River Gorge. My routine was rigid: track commercial rail cargo, monitor the signals, and ensure no lines cross. Until one terrible night, every truth I used to navigate the real world, the world of steel and logic, completely collapsed. It was 3:40 a.m., and I was on the peak part of my isolated shift. The sound outside was total sensory deprivation, a continuous, heavy drumming rain mixed with the profound, thick, terrifying silence of the immense river fog, which had enveloped my entire tower and the lines below. No visual light, no sound of wind. Suddenly, over my headphones, running the perfectly clear, highly insulated dispatch primary voice line, I picked up a frantic signal, a sudden, clear, high-pitched crackling static, immediately followed by a precise, coherent, strong transmission of an intense, emergency maintenance hiss. A train was stopped and bleeding air. The train's engine operator's voice, a man's voice, full of extreme fear and immediate panic, screamed one single, long, dragged-out word directly into my headphones. BRAKES. I snapped to immediate, decisive action. My job was to isolate and clear the line for the rapid emergency intervention now. I checked the line on the massive, archaic dispatch main grid map, the red and green lights of the lines completely visible and clean. No trains were stopped on the line. The path was clear for 60 whole miles. The emergency call was coming from a track segment, the 521 switch, that had been entirely decommissioned and physically mothballed 15 years prior, only accessible by two sets of non-operational metal siding tracks. The train had physically stopped the line outside of reality. I immediately picked up the static-filled signal now. The operator was still in a full, blind panic, speaking completely incoherent words, pleading urgently for a clearance back up the line. I cut him off, speaking with full authority. "Dispatcher to whatever unit you were, you are not on a primary line. Please repeat your exact coordinates, or I am cutting the transmission." My own clean voice was immediately challenged by a collective, vast, and unified chorus of human voice that completely erupted behind the lone voice of the operator. Not static, not interference, but a deep, immense collection of 30 or 40 loud, desperate, intensely cold whispers that immediately dominated the line, all of them speaking one single word directly into my brain. "He is cold. He can't move. Turn him off. Turn him off." The whispers were the collective voice of a full cargo inventory. But this cargo was not steel or goods. It was a full payload of souls. The full horror was this: the last train to nowhere wasn't a living train. It was a full-sized, phantom train of the dead, traveling outside of the modern dispatch reality. And it had somehow forced its way onto a single, closed, high-security line just to be acknowledged. The terror broke my professional veneer. I disconnected the entire line immediately, a massive, forbidden action that required a full digital protocol wipe. Silence. After 45 minutes of cold panic and profound terror, after securing the massive glass doors, no warning alarm had sounded. No supervisor had called. The external storm simply continued its deafening rhythm. I was sitting in the tower, completely alone, fully absolved of protocol. As I sat in the utter, empty silence of the small, swaying tower, I looked down the immense black shaft of the decommissioned 521 switch. Suddenly, the single line 200 yards below my visual perimeter erupted into a frantic flash of intense, burning white light. The light was pure, concentrated, high-intensity color, the fierce, agonizing electrical flare that an enormous train engine creates when full brake pressure is suddenly and violently released. The burning flash illuminated the deep fog, revealing the clear, perfect black shape of a massive 1940s-era steam engine and 12 long, low, heavy cargo cars fully and completely attached to the ghost line. The massive line was absolutely packed with figures, thin, pale, unnervingly still shadows, sitting tightly, side by side, perfectly still in the intense, high-energy white glare, perfectly still against the backdrop of the massive, chaotic fog. The massive, beautiful antique engine instantly and silently began moving backwards, pulling the entire terrified payload of souls deep back into the fog and the absolute dead space of the decommissioned siding. The white light from the braking energy intensified to unbearable proportions, and the entire train completely, physically vanished with a powerful, sucking swoosh of sound, gone entirely into the thick, wet, deep oblivion of the industrial night. The terrifying noise was immediately absorbed by the intense, cold, wet storm. I quit the job immediately. I don't care about the regulations. The last train to nowhere finally arrived at its last track and stopped in the darkness, not for maintenance, but because the entire payload of terrified souls demanded only one singular, absolute action from the observer. They needed my conscious action to simply stop to verify their ultimate, frightening reality. But once I confirmed its coordinates, the entire engine and its endless, terrifying cargo were entirely consumed by the ultimate speed of a full break and burn, forcing the whole line completely and permanently backward into the dead space. I'm safe now, but every time I hear the loud, consistent sound of sudden rain washing back hard over the freeway, I check the mirrors to see if the engine, white-hot, terrified, and backward, is using the cover of the sound to make one final attempt to enter my reality. Story 2. Long-haul trucking a semi across the middle of Texas is primarily a test of human endurance against heat, boredom, and immense, unchanging flat space. On one sustained midnight shift outside of Odessa, running east with a shipment of high-pressure pipe, the weather suddenly, aggressively changed. The immense Texas heat gave way to a cold, thick, relentless, sustained, chaotic rainstorm that blanketed the entire landscape in a chilling, dense, black and silver cover. I pulled over violently at a huge, poorly lit, entirely empty truck stop known as the Mesa Pull-Off, desperate for a break from my blinding road hypnosis. As I climbed out of my warm cab into the intensely cold, wet, absolute silence of the enormous asphalt parking lot, a strange, profound sight immediately arrested my attention. Standing perfectly still, completely exposed to the high velocity, driving rain beside the closed restaurant door, was a single, immense, towering human figure. He was wearing a stark, perfectly white, unhood religious robe, an archaic sight completely wrong for the scene. The robe was thin, made of some strange fabric that seemed to completely repel the aggressive water, and he carried only a single, large, beautiful, dark wooden staff stripped clean white at its top by some incredible prior abrasion. The man was absolutely still, staring not at the immense storm, but directly into the dark, rain-soaked center of my truck's grill like an angry, solitary prophet who had just discovered the key element of a massive, final, coming plague. I immediately tried to avoid the figure, pulling out my umbrella and trying to walk past him towards the gas pump for a quick, single, fast-paced transaction. As I moved, the man spoke, unprompted, his voice utterly immense, deep, and unnervingly resonant in the quiet, empty lot, completely unmuffled by the immense volume of the surrounding cold storm. "Stop, Michael! Don't go to the light! The numbers you are chasing are dead and full of salt now. But the dream you had of the water breaking is what brought you to the mesa." He used my actual first name, one I hadn't broadcast to anyone in a clean 1,000 miles. And then immediately and accurately quoted the entire content of a single, deeply personal waking nightmare I had experienced only 12 hours prior about a localized hydraulic failure at the base of a dam. The terror broke my paralysis. I swung the large, commercial-grade short umbrella violently open for protection and snapped a terrified, absolute truth into the cold, empty air. "Who are you, and what do you want?" The truck stop prophet did not move, did not flinch, did not close his strangely intense, silver blue, incredibly glossy eyes that seemed to absorb the entire output of the overhead light standard. He simply nodded once, a deep, slow, intense affirmation of my compliance. He then began speaking to me again, but this time, the rhythmic speech was a low, slow, detailed, unceasing delivery of absolutely cold, professional, complex industrial data. He ran a precise, coherent structural audit of my entire massive truck's current road rig, quoting the precise date the final axle weld had been performed, and detailing the complete volume capacity of my current high-pressure pipe shipment. The stream of technical information was absolutely terrifying, accurate, and completely, utterly outside the domain of any human conversation. The prophet concluded his long, rhythmic recitation with a terrifying, single prediction. And here, his immense, resonant voice dropped completely into an unnerving, low, organized whisper that spoke entirely of my own, single, most private, deeply concealed shame and professional fear. "The final failure of all your work is always the same thing, Michael. You forget the deep maintenance. The final judgment of the road fails when you trust the cheap metal. The Black Spirit has completely finished its final work. He is eating through the engine block now." I ripped out my phone to dial 911, immediately abandoning the gas transaction. As I hit the contact button, the terrifying prophecy was confirmed. From directly beneath the massive engine block of my 10-ton cargo truck, there was a single, long, low, profoundly wet, sucking sound, the rhythmic, organic sound of an incredibly dense, immensely powerful, single, internal suction rapidly and continuously drawing up every single specialized metal fluid my engine had, the oil, the battery acid, the brake line fluid. The sound of massive machine parts grinding dryly against each other was the horrible background track to this single, continuous, organized organic siphoning. The entire massive structure shook, shuddering violently under the intense, internal negative pressure. I screamed and fled into the massive darkness of the deep truck stop perimeter, sprinting hard over the empty asphalt and sand, completely abandoning the truck and the key and cargo forever. I didn't stop until I had reached a small, permanent building 5 empty miles from the site that still showed a single, warm light in its interior. The truck stop prophet's final act was completely, absolutely clear to me. The towering figure was not merely a warning prophet of doom. He was the pure, immense, specialized, supernatural demon of permanent critical maintenance failure that utilized all the immense isolation and cold atmospheric static of the desert to reveal its deepest plan. His absolute, organized, terrifying objective was twofold. First, to deliver the crushing, total truth of a single isolated man's overwhelming, hidden technical vulnerability. And second, to use that profound, deep internal emotional trauma to permanently immobilize the vehicle by entirely consuming its physical, liquid vital fluids, forever trapping the truck and its vast, vulnerable technological cargo in the immense, consuming blackness of the immense, cold Texas desert. Story 3. Working as a lead track maintainer for the old, forgotten subway lines beneath the dense, immense, subterranean core of Brooklyn, New York, is essentially working inside a vast, cold, cylindrical tomb. My shift, running the single safety engine from 3 in the morning until the 6 a.m. rush hour starts, primarily involved isolating the old, heavily used T-train tunnel switching track while the crew performed a complex inspection on the century-old steel rail system. The atmosphere was a perpetual bath of thick condensation, raw sewage, and profound silence, only broken by the sharp, metallic squeals of the intermittent work lights being shut down the distant tunnels. The weather above ground was completely chaotic. A persistent, intense, freezing, vertical late winter storm was battering the outer city with massive sheets of high-pressure rain and snow, amplifying the intense humidity inside the ground. At 4:40 a.m., my full, total isolation was cemented by a profound, terrible warning. I was running the track line on a slow, continuous engine speed past a massive, rusted, high archway of rebar and cement, the former Bay Ridge 86th subway station, permanently closed due to flooding 3 decades prior. The entire structure was black, decaying, and profoundly dead. As my train slowly passed the massive blackness of the single broken opening, all the sensitive external rail sensors that defined the immediate path of the abandoned spur abruptly roared to life. A complete, overwhelming burst of raw sensor energy that I had last seen during a major system electrical fire. The array was firing a unified, terrifying warning signal to my brain. A physical train of massive tonnage and velocity was stationary and fully active, completely loaded, and dead stopped on the non-operational, non-existent, abandoned track only 40 feet from my face. I slammed the single-line emergency switch immediately, fighting to arrest all the chaotic, terrifying motion of my small engine. Complete, deafening silence descended. I was entirely alone, trapped with my engine idling 40 feet from the precise physical point the massive spectral warning signal had originated. My intense yellow emergency lamp fixed a single beam on the dark, massive archway. The subway tunnel entrance was entirely empty and terrifyingly still. The internal air, perpetually cold and wet, now radiated an intense heat, smelling of massive electrical static, high heat copper, and the horrible, dense, familiar stench of old brake smoke. The precise, sickening, single smell a train's brake system generates in a severe rail lockup. My auditory perception completely severed contact. Over the sound of my single, raw, terrified breathing, I suddenly picked up a bizarre, complex, high-frequency, rhythmic sound that completely flooded my small space. The quick, dry, distinct hush-hush-hush of massive, complex, industrial-grade pneumatic wheel axles quickly, violently, and aggressively spinning with zero traction on a set of wet, permanent steel tracks. The sound was unnerving because it conveyed immense, continuous physical effort without any actual forward movement. The perfect, controlled sound of a colossal disaster waiting to happen. I screamed into my active line. "Dispatcher to any train in the D-line sector. There is an unacknowledged, deadly train stopped at 86. Who are you?" My clean voice was immediately challenged by a complex, unified, terrifying chorus of 50 or 60 high-pitched, faint, weeping, dry voices that completely erupted directly out of my static-filled safety headphones. Not static, not interference, but a massive, coherent voice of pure, unadulterated human despair that completely eclipsed the lone operator's strained reply. The terrifying, sobbing language was continuous, rhythmic, and perfectly repeating a single, agonizing vowel sound. "Leave his line alone. The track is our home. The air is cold. You are his final guest." The combined weeping, mass chanting, and terrified confession was the single, collective voice of a train full of desperate, lost, terrifying, dead passengers who were permanently pinned to the single abandoned track. I immediately tore the insulated headphones from my head, severing all contact to the physical sound terror. I scrambled off the engine, pulling free the single steel spike I used to re-gauge the track line. I needed visual confirmation now. My final, desperate, terrified glance immediately shattered my last vestige of rational reality. Positioned completely within the sheer blackness of the recessed dead track 40 feet from my face, a massive, ancient, immense, dark train car, a subway relic from the 1960s, suddenly flickered to life. The entire row of immense, antique windows exploded into a single, high, bright, white-blue color, entirely illuminated by a strange, unholy internal light. I could now see the entire immense configuration of the full cargo train, 12 long cars, packed impossibly full, completely filled with silent, still figures, pale, absolutely motionless, staring completely straight ahead, permanently pinned to their hard vinyl seats. The terrified, screaming white light of the final car completely, instantly pulsed and flickered 3 perfect times as a synchronized signal to my terror, on OFF on. And then, the entire massive column of the train plunged 3 complete, terrifying feet with an immense, powerful, hydraulic jerk of static, perfectly and silently coming to a catastrophic, coordinated, terrifying full stop on the broken dead track. I ran back to my lonely, idling maintenance engine, not stopping for the keys, the spike, or my desperate need to reverse out. I simply opened the throttle to total speed, leaving my machine to move at total chaos and speed, driving completely hard back toward the open space of the outside world, my eyes fixed only on the cold, beautiful external exposure of the constant cold rain I was desperately waiting to see. The subway phantom stop was not a warning about human traffic. It was the absolute, organized final action of a completely isolated terror. The massive, organized train of the dead had completed its final journey to its eternal end of the stop, and it was screaming the absolute, horrifying truth of its permanent presence to any living conductor or observer who dared to interfere with its silent, final, dark, eternal resting place. Story 4. Up Interstate 40 in the isolated, high, cold plateaus of the central Arizona desert, the absolute darkness is broken only by the immense, cold, constant, rhythmic downpour of massive, isolated rainstorms, the kind of environment that strips away your mind's internal defenses. I was running a long-haul contract driving specialized research equipment, my base of operations entirely confined to the small, insulated metal shell of my truck's cab as I crossed the empty Navajo Nation. My shift was all midnight driving, staring through the high-intensity beams into the heavy, constant, drumming rain that made the entire dry environment seem perpetually cold and wet. In an area of non-existent human signals, my single, old, worn FM radio provided the only comfort against that total isolation. The terror began abruptly, a single acoustic anomaly on the low end of the FM spectrum, near 90.1. I flipped my dial down one notch from the crackling Spanish church music, and the expected static noise was quickly replaced by a sudden, sustained, low-pitched drone. The sound was entirely synthesized, like a perfect, continuous, single-frequency test tone. It was incredibly loud, incredibly clear, and completely without any recognizable human origin. My hand seized on the warm dial, convinced I had somehow just tuned into a powerful, isolated military broadcast signal. The low-frequency drone was immediately superimposed with a clear, calm, incredibly dry human voice, a distinct, steady, low-volume bass monologue that was speaking a full, complex paragraph of continuous information directly into my single right ear, as if the source audio was physically generated inside the very center of my speaker panel under the sheer sound pressure of the electronic drone. The terrifying content of the voice wasn't a military code or instruction. It was my voice. Precisely mine. My natural baritone, my specific, fast cadence, even the subtle, nervous upward tick at my vocal inflection. But the content was wrong. The voice was not narrating today's thoughts. It was having a furious, internalized argument with itself over the contents of my own private journal entries. The argument was frantic, delivered in a rush of strained energy, speaking of anxieties I hadn't voiced out loud in years. No, don't mention the code. Stop talking about the dog. The dog is irrelevant. You are isolating yourself too easily, Mark. You are doing this to yourself. The terror gripped me immediately. I was listening to a clear, precise, current reflection of my total, complete internal monologue, broadcast out over a powerful radio frequency. The sheer audacity of the privacy violation was crippling. I snatched my hand from the dial as if the single piece of industrial equipment was scalding my skin. Logically, I knew it must be some incredible atmospheric trick. Temperature inversion, high-altitude static mixed with a distant broadcast. But the sound wasn't distorted, and the sentences were completely coherent, intelligent, and focused on my mind's content. My body felt immediately attacked. I sat in absolute stillness in the vibrating metal and glass cage of the van, hard hammering intensely, staring out at the blurred blackness of the thick, fast-moving rain. I pulled the small emergency receiver closer to my right ear, listening to the private mental terror. The voice, my voice, continued his monologue, moving on from private fears to a short review of my immediate circumstances. He sees the mountain. Don't look at the mountain. The code is 1782. You are going to look for the fire now. Don't go. My internal voice was now narrating a desperate, clear warning about my intentions 10 minutes into my future. I threw the metal radio handset to the floor, terrified of its utter accuracy. I drove the heavy van hard out of the pull-off, determined to escape the acoustic anomaly and find a single motel with a working television. Not 2 minutes later, driving the dark highway hard into the wall of chaotic rain, the driver's side front tire abruptly collapsed with an enormous, physical bang. I wrestled the heavy van hard to the shoulder, almost fishtailing into the black, unlit abyss of the valley 40 feet below. The van was immobilized, dead. I scrambled out into the immense, chaotic storm, shining my powerful lamp at the shattered tire. The steel wheel housing was catastrophically failed, not a simple blowout, but a linear, clean snap across the steel core itself. I called an emergency tow back to Albuquerque, leaving the broken machine and its final terrifying warning. I huddled inside the driver's cab, shaking violently, desperately avoiding contact with any of the internal wiring connected to the stereo. The tow truck arrived an hour later, a heavy, familiar 1940s model. The driver, a weathered man in a deep, dark oilskin coat, spoke to me only once, his voice cracking like dry tree branches. Bad brake. Real bad metal fatigue. You shouldn't have been listening to that nonsense, son. I looked at him, startled. He knew about the radio. He just quietly shook his head, shining his massive, red floodlight on the broken van's wreckage. He unhooked the powerful tow hook and started the immense, slow, physical labor of connecting the broken rear axle. The rhythmic clanging of the 3-foot-long, heavy-duty tow chain connecting the two massive vehicles was the only stable sound in the world, a comforting, simple, mechanical labor sound. Then, one long, terrifying, high-pitched scre cut through the sound of the rain, the horrifying noise of the massive tow chain as it violently retracted its safety mechanism for the final, violent pull. The sound ended. The towman just stood there completely silent in the intense, high-energy red glare of his own machinery, his dark, soaking oilskin coat covering his entire face. He took a single deep, loud sharp intake of frozen breath, the sound of someone just emerging from the cold lake. Then, the rhythmic sound of a familiar voice began to speak in a strange, thick, waxy bass tone right against the cab's small vent. Don't look at the back of the tire, Mark. It's too late. The light is terrible, and the tow is needed for the broken seal you are making. You should have stayed isolated. The voice was mine again, but severely distorted by the massive external cold being pressed to the wall. I abandoned the van and the tow operator right there, running headfirst into the immense, isolated darkness of the cold desert night. The voice under the desert radio wasn't a warning about my journey. It was a sophisticated, pervasive network parasite feeding on my anxiety that knew the exact structural flaw of my vehicle, providing a terror that only spoke in cold, hard, precise, external facts. I never touched a radio again. The voice was the sound of my own inevitable systemic collapse. Story 5. The old house always felt heavy, deeply quiet, and completely cold. It was a massive, sprawling, 2-story relic I had rented near a large, still lake in the Olympic National Forest of Washington State, purely for its massive solitude, 3 full miles from the nearest single piece of human pavement. I was a software coder, entirely isolated, using the remote atmosphere as a psychological break from the sheer density of constant digital information. The local fear was intense. 3 strange drownings had occurred on the still, silent lake over the past 60 years. All young people, all drowned exactly 40 feet from shore. My psychological terror, however, came from the interior of the house itself, the profound horror of the family cabin curse. The atmosphere of intense cold and silence shattered 2 weeks into my tenancy. The heavy, immense, constant, relentless, gray-white sound of a massive, cold rainstorm had settled aggressively over the entire forest, surrounding the total isolation of the small 2-story structure. Late one silent night, at 3 a.m., in the profound, consuming quiet, I heard a terrible sound that completely froze my blood and fully dissolved my emotional anchor to the present. Positioned exactly at the bottom of the external, wooden access staircase, A series of short, faint, pathetic, single human cries began, the loud, thin, mournful sound of a baby crying for its father, desperately and incessantly repeating a single, sharp syllable. Daddy. Daddy. The high acoustic volume of the constant sound was terrifyingly clear and completely isolated over the top of the white sound of the immense, cold downpour on the roof shingles. I snapped to immediate terror. I was completely alone. There were no other houses for any conceivable miles around the immense acreage. My mind screamed this single rational truth: a lost child is outside the cabin. Find them faster now. I grabbed my jacket and coat and ran for the front door. I pulled open its immense, heavy latch, and threw my body onto the porch right into the torrentially falling, cold rain, sweeping a single, high-intensity beam flashlight across the entire, massive acre of the deserted lawn. Nothing. Total, pure, immense, profound black silence. The absolute dark absorbed all light and human presence. The rhythmic crying instantly, completely stopped the moment I put my physical body on the cold, exposed surface of the exterior porch. I retreated, slamming the heavy wooden doors shut. But the profound atmospheric cold the crying sound had left in its wake was instantly replaced not by silence, but by a new, focused, interior sound horror. From directly inside the living room's immense, silent brick hearth which had been cleaned only hours before, a sustained, low-pitched, incredibly slow drumming sound began, like a child's single fist gently hitting a full leather bass drum with simple, slow repetition. The methodical, constant pang-pang-pang of the drum beat was immediately followed by a chorus of 3 or 4 faint, gentle, completely flat, childlike humming voices singing a complex, long-finished nursery lullaby, a quiet, gentle, perfect, angelic treble sound that was utterly beautiful and completely terrifying. These voices were not screaming for help. They were actively, permanently, serenely present in the material world. My terror was finalized by a single, sharp piece of physical evidence. Driven frantic by the sound, I immediately grabbed the largest digital screen I had, my professional desktop monitor, and held its face up to the hearth's immense darkness for visual confirmation of the phenomenon. And the final terror was immediate and absolute. Reflected clearly and perfectly in the passive, dark screen of the empty glass, positioned directly above the silent fireplace hearth, a massive, ancient, immense, dark brown, 4-foot-long single length of wet, massive, heavy rope completely absorbed the entire cold, reflected light output. The rope, completely still in the reflection, had simply been quietly tied into a terrifying, massive, perfect, single slip knot, the single opening of the loop facing directly out toward the center of the living room. Inviting the single action, I abandoned the heavy monitor, screaming and running headfirst for the back door in absolute, high-intensity panic. As I exited the back of the small, terrible 2-story ruin, I heard the final communication from the entity. The sweet, beautiful, immense, synchronized humming had completely stopped. It was permanently replaced by a single, loud, organized, simple, full-body plunge, the immense, terrible sound of a massive volume of still, cold water suddenly and violently being thrown forward against the dry interior plaster walls of the bedroom section. The water splash hit with such intense impact it shook the entire house foundation. The full section of the second floor had just been successfully flooded. I ran hard, completely lost in the immense forest and the final, beautiful blanket of cold rain. I never returned to the cabin. The family's fear was complete, cold, and absolute. 4 children had drowned in the lake because of a parental negligence, and the old structure, cursed by the loss, was now completely possessed by the persistent, unflagging psychic presence of the permanent, unending, rhythmic cries of drowning, dead children. The beautiful humming and the comforting nursery music were simply designed to lure the new living observer into one specific act, accepting the single, isolated, cold comfort of their fatal, permanent water-filled trap. My final terror remains simple, that the continuous sound of an intense, silent, repetitive rain is not a comfort or a blanket for sleep. It is the single, immense, constant, ambient noise of permanent, continuous drowning. Story 6. I run an industrial clearing contract, mostly cleaning up the immense, forgotten, high-stress projects after they failed their safety inspections. My last contract took me to an ancient, multi-million-dollar, sprawling gymnasium structure in the outer, dead silent suburbs of Baltimore, the complete, massive, former sports complex of a defunct military high school. The main locker room facility, designed with massive rows of over 700 original 1950s metal lockers, had been sealed off for 2 full decades after the closure. My job was straightforward: full survey and removal of all remaining material. My schedule was brutal: midnight to 6 a.m., completely alone, with only the profound, intense silence of the isolated complex and the constant, cold, aggressive hammering of the severe electrical storm on the exterior aluminum ceiling to keep me company. The entire atmosphere of the vast locker room structure was defined by an immense, pervasive, dense sense of deep, aggressive human shame and failure. The whole room smelled of dust, old mold, and incredibly stale, dried-out sweat. I found the acoustic anomalies immediately during my first run-through: a rhythmic, intermittent, extremely high-pitched sonic scream that defied the laws of structural acoustics. It wasn't loud, but continuous, a painful, fast-paced, rhythmic clang-clang-clang that originated from the far, dark southern wall of the vast, immense locker facility, the area where the team showers had been located. The repetitive, rhythmic sonic attack completely overcame the immense exterior chaotic sound of the storm. I immediately grabbed my short-form voice recorder, intending to find a logical explanation for the consistent noise. But the sound wasn't chaotic. It was organized. The rhythmic, mechanical clanging was immediately followed by a bizarre, short, rhythmic burst of male human voice, a low, aggressive, distinct, professional shouting voice that was constantly repeating intense, short-term commands. I immediately recognized the frantic sound of a full, organized drill coach's routine being verbally enacted and carried out on the silent floor beneath my feet. The rhythmic metal banging was the final, hard, repetitive smash of an object hitting the cold metal of the locker doors, a terrifying, single, organized smack that completed the pattern for a single row. My terror broke. I moved to the deep southern wing, sweeping my high-intensity light over the entirety of the vast, abandoned structure. Empty lockers speak. All 500 steel lockers were completely empty, static, and silent. Yet, as I got closer to the source of the high-pitched metallic banging, the chaotic, desperate, rhythmic metal sound instantly moved to the adjacent row of silent, metal boxes. The phenomenon was a mobile field of organized, aggressive sound. I was entirely convinced I was being tormented by an organized, violent field of active poltergeists, the eternal spirits of some desperately defeated, shamed, isolated military team, permanently trapped in a cycle of eternal failure they couldn't physically, emotionally, or psychologically escape. And my single, living presence was an intense interruption they had to either recruit or destroy. I abandoned my physical safety gear on the table in the office and crept, silent and low, from the single security office. My last rational thought screamed the only possible theory: what if the sound wasn't meant to be frightening? What if the aggressive, organized rhythm of the metal doors was their only method of physical communication to break the eternal torment of silence? I decided to meet their rhythmic language head-on. I grabbed the single largest, wettest towel from the cold bag and made myself a single mute. I then walked to the closest locker, number 44, and slapped the massive, thick, wet towel hard against the hollow, cold steel of its door. Thwack! I timed my single organic physical sound precisely to the rhythm of the eternal torment. The complete audio reality immediately shattered. The relentless, organized, continuous clanging immediately stopped entirely. A profound, absolute, sudden silence descended that was utterly cold, immense, and entirely consuming, immediately replacing the terrifying background sound of the raging exterior metallic storm. The silence was instantly replaced by a single, terrifyingly organized single whisper. A clear, simple, concise, professional boy's voice that had now fully manifested directly from the air 3 feet behind my right ear, an unnaturally soft, high-pitched plea that completely shattered the silence of the immense, cold facility. "Thank you for listening for us, sir. The shame is deep. Our captain still wants to keep the door shut. He says we're not worthy to leave. Are you staying to coach the next game for us now? The whisper finished. The immense, organized, rhythmic clanging immediately and violently returned to the furthest end of the room and immediately increased its rhythm by 2 full power settings, intensifying its speed, sound, aggression, and velocity. Their single leader was not pleased with the human interference. I was now exposed by my brief, compassionate moment of connection. I screamed and ran in a blind panic straight for the front exit of the structure, abandoning the heavy uniform, the expensive equipment, and my quiet life entirely. I collapsed outside, my body completely given over to the freezing, relentless, chaotic storm. The terror of empty lockers speak was simple. The entire complex was haunted not by disorganized ghosts, but by a precise, complex, synchronized team of entirely organized poltergeists trapped in an eternal shame that constantly repeated their specific failure against the cold interior of the complex. My single, final act of compassion listening wasn't a structural compromise. It was a single, immense, emotional acceptance of the full trauma, which had completely broken the team's internal rule for absolute silence against the public space. My simple human intercession had simply enraged their eternal, defeated, ashamed coach, who immediately accelerated their internal torment with a powerful, aggressive burst of organized, absolute rhythm. I will never look up at the full, white light of a gymnasium structure again. The simple sound of pure human noise is their final, absolute, perfect terror. Story 7. I was taking the final inspection job on an immaculately restored luxury suite in an ancient, grand resort hotel outside of Tampa, Florida, a massive, sprawling 1920s-era hotel sitting right on the constant, warm, aggressive coastline of the Gulf. My work was structural and technical, but I took the contract mostly for the profound, deep history the old relic of the Florida Roaring Twenties still radiated. The main issue was contained entirely inside the final section of the building, the old Olympic Grand Pool, a beautiful, immense, terrifyingly deep, Olympic-sized swimming facility that had been drained, entirely shut down, and permanently sealed for a full 5 decades due to multiple drowning incidents on site. My job was simple, full structural integrity inspection, all recorded by my body-mounted camera. I had a full 8 hours of isolated access, all under the cover of one of those intense, violent, high-humidity, chaotic summer rainstorms that make the interior of Florida feel perpetually wet, hot, and cold. The sound of the torrential rain battering the thick, high-vaulted glass ceiling of the vast, empty pool room was a deafening, constant sound that both soothed and terrified my focus. The initial terror was absolute silence. I rappelled down the internal scaffolding line a full 60 feet to the immense, perfectly dry, white concrete bottom of the vast, open pool facility, landing with a loud, ringing physical crunch that instantly echoed 300 times around the enormous concave ceiling. The massive space was dry, empty, immense, completely dominated by the singular, massive crack that ran the full vertical length of the deep-end tiling structure. I began my physical inspection, scanning the entire surface of the cracked, aging tiling with my high-output, wide-angle headlight beam. At the 5-hour mark, deep inside the physical void, staring down the long vertical split in the structure, I found what I was truly looking for, a small, entirely circular arch tunnel, roughly visible and sealed only by cheap, thick, white concrete infilling that was badly eroding into the deeper seam. Not geological. Not structural. Human-made. The final, terrifying realization of the last time I went diving was upon me immediately. Someone had created a deep-cut access point into either the main substructure tank or the external filtration system through the core of the immense facility's sealed environment. The terror was all local, all confined to this small, specific structure. I grabbed my handheld seismograph, aimed it right at the thick layer of compressed, aging concrete infilling the circle, and immediately ran a full, high-intensive internal frequency scan. The readout was instantaneous and terrifying. The thick membrane was hollowed out. My machine produced an immediate, clear output diagram showing the single, enormous cylindrical space behind the eroding ceiling wall was now completely water-filled, containing an immense, quiet, vast volume of perpetual cold, still water, reaching immense, undetermined depths beneath the dry surface I was standing on. The total physical proof of the internal, submerged reality completely shattered my entire belief structure. I knew, with an absolute, terrifying clarity, that the serene, terrifying quiet I was inspecting was only the floor of a pool built over a deliberate, immense, underwater crypt, a vast water-filled system the owners had attempted to permanently suppress. I immediately attached my most sensitive audio array to the small, white, cement-filled archway, set the gain to max, and stepped back 50 feet, desperately waiting for an explanation. The speaker remained entirely silent for 10 whole minutes, amplifying only the immense acoustic pressure of the external chaotic rain. And then, a sound that completely destroyed the atmosphere of quiet, a complex, rapid, intensely loud, clear pang of a thick, wet, cold, human fist hammering constantly, methodically against the thin internal wall directly below the sealed section. The sound was frantic, terrified, and utterly focused, a simple, non-stop, desperate, rhythmic human plea for immediate, physical assistance. The pounding was immediately followed by a low, drawn-out sucking noise, the long, immense sound of someone, now trapped and fully exhausted, painfully attempting to compress the absolute final air supply from a massively drained, wet, cold medium. I screamed into the immense empty facility, demanding the full and immediate attention of any living soul. This wasn't a warning, it was a complex series of sounds that perfectly communicated the full, immediate, terrifying truth of intense, final human physical entrapment. I raced back to the emergency surface climb. The terrifying, organizing sound of the frantic manual drumming stopped completely, immediately replaced by a clear, final single voice that transmitted a powerful, single word through the air. "Stay!" The profound, guttural tone vibrated the immense cold steel of my harness. I tore the rappel line off its anchor point, scrambling in a frenzy up the wet scaffolding. As I ascended the long, dangerous climb, a massive, powerful, high-velocity wave of single, cold water suddenly roared from the center of the structure's cracked white-tiled floor, completely obliterating the exact spot where I had just been standing. The profound physical speed and volume of the single burst of freezing, dark liquid entirely bypassed the original split in the immense pool structure, forcing an immense, chaotic, sudden external pressure event on the final sealed facility. The final terror was clear. The entity was not trapped behind the concrete. It was physically trying to flood the empty structure, forcing its terrifying domain back onto the warm surface world, trying to bring me under its control. I burst the top emergency door lock with a terrifying physical violence, and ran completely out of the complex, and into the arms of the startled gate guard, completely abandoning the high-paying contract. I never spoke of the single, massive, intentional flooding event. The terrible, profound truth that almost killed me was uncovered only 2 years later, when the formal demolition contract revealed one precise, final, horrifying fact: the archway I found was not a tank access. It was the original entrance to a secret suite built under the old facility's deep end, permanently sealed when the hotel was foreclosed on. The room was found completely waterlogged, a human-sized coffin filled with cold, stagnant water. The entire massive section of the pool I was investigating was a perpetual, immense, human death machine, designed to lure all life in and convert its warmth into cold, stagnant water, preserving the final terror of the trapped souls forever. My final terror. The only final reason the powerful creature had demanded I remain inside the massive structure for the single event was so I could be the final, last living occupant that was simply physically drowned as a new, terrifying, sentient, powerful waterline for the immense, cold power to rise. Story 8. I work an overnight cleaning contract for a massive, cold, sterile research laboratory complex in suburban New Jersey. The building is a confusing, multi-level maze of glass windows, concrete monoliths, and intensely bright corridors that only really matter after 2 a.m. My job is simple: full sanitation of all offices and the main communal space. My schedule is brutally isolated, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., completely alone, using a single, oversized, high-output vacuum cleaner to dominate the massive, clinical silence. The building is utterly still, devoid of all life, only broken by the pervasive, thick, white noise sound of the high-velocity, chaotic rainstorm continuously rattling the huge plate glass windows of the sealed structure. My initial break from the absolute silence came subtly. I was running the immense, old-style vacuum cleaner up a 200-foot stretch of the main administrative hallway. My pace was slow, rhythmic, methodic, and precise. I run each spot of carpet 3 times for professional perfection. I was halfway down the immense hall, completely absorbed in the static, white roar of the mechanical process when I looked up and saw it. 40 feet ahead of my precise line, in the deepest, final section of my current path, the smooth, immaculate carpet, which I had last cleaned a mere 3 hours prior, was strangely, fully dirty. Not a light scattering of dust, but a pervasive, dense, organized film of black soot and gray dust completely covering a long, 6-foot-long single track of the clean pile beneath it. The contamination was absolute and precisely located immediately in front of my single, rolling cleaning unit. Logic broke me. I had just cleaned that entire section. I immediately moved up the hallway and reran the full section of contaminated carpet with intense, physical repetition. I forced the massive suction unit hard over the dark spot 5 times, until the immense, thick pile fiber was restored to its professional, clean beige color. I was intensely satisfied by my single victory over the chaos, running up 1 meter further down the hall. I turned my head immediately, sweeping my beam behind my line of sight. The previous area, perfectly clean a mere 3 seconds prior, was now completely and entirely filled again with the immense, same, terrifying, precise film of black soot. The perfect, precise, dark contamination now stretched 8 relentless feet across the carpet, fully matching my total distance progressed up the immaculate hallway. My entire process was now being physically, instantaneously reversed. My professional work was instantly and actively being entirely erased by an invisible, immediate, organized entity working directly behind me, the factory floor cleaner. Terror seized my entire rhythm. I stood absolutely still, holding my silent cleaning machine, utterly immobilized by the sight of the expanding, terrifying field of darkness behind me. I realized immediately my work was useless. My physical presence and professional motion were simply serving as the point of organized reference for the active, unseen entity's anti-cleaning field. The horrifying action was driven by absolute efficiency. I abandoned all attempts at logical cleaning. I left my machine running on the clean floor and quietly retreated back toward the security shack, hoping the sound of the high-volume suction would keep the dark contamination at bay. As I slowly backed up into the total structural silence of the stairwell, I heard a terrible sound that completely crushed my escape plan. From the deep, black chaos of the hallway I was last cleaning, the massive, aggressive, rhythmic whrrr of my running, abandoned vacuum cleaner completely and immediately ceased. The entire vast silence of the facility was not consumed by the white noise of the rain, but with a profound, sudden, intense hissing sound, the low, continuous auditory effect on the interior ceiling from the massive chemical processing vents, followed by an intense, overwhelming, absolutely non-negotiable smell. The pervasive air in the sterile hallway was completely filled with the thick, cloying smell of highly flammable, dry, acidic acetone and incredibly stale, dried-out blood matter. The contamination was now chemical and complete. The powerful surge of external heat had instantly broken and melted my powerful cleaning machine. I slammed the nearest emergency exit stairwell latch and plunged into the cold, utter darkness of the steel staircase structure. I scrambled down 3 long flights, absolutely blind with fear, pulling myself hard on the single steel centerline rail for stability. As I reached the final structural element of my isolated escape, a simple, low, organized voice spoke directly to my ear from the uninsulated steel wall that I was physically sliding against. A clear, gentle, female voice, incredibly cold, possessing immense, permanent exhaustion, perfectly and concisely articulated one final sentence precisely into the thick bone of my temporal lobe. Please! We do this for the boss. Leave the dirt alone. You are making the place cleaner than he deserves. The voice ended in a brief, agonizing, physical gasping sigh of deep, absolute, total, unending human relief. I burst the external door latch of the facility and plunged my body hard out into the cold, hard, terrifying rain of the white, screaming chaos, not stopping until I could no longer see the immense black silhouette of the silent, sealed research complex I had just survived. The factory floor cleaner was not a simple poltergeist. It was the organized, professional entity of a permanent, defeated, dead and violently shamed cleaning crew, forever locked in an eternal contract failure by the clean nature of the immense work they failed to complete 20 years ago. The persistent, overwhelming horror was simple. Their only ritual was to forever reverse the living cleanup of the immense, cold facility, ensuring that the massive volume of corporate filth remained permanently organized and physically present in the clean space, a final, total, unchangeable historical testament to their single moment of profound moral and professional failing. My final, absolute, terrifying realization was simple, that my perfect, professional effort was entirely the single final force that kept them permanently working and trapped in the silence of their endless, terrible contract. The single act of trying to leave their workplace perfectly clean. Story 9. I was taking the final inspection job on an immaculately restored luxury suite in an ancient, grand resort hotel outside of Tampa, Florida, a massive, sprawling 1920s-era hotel sitting right on the constant, warm, aggressive coastline of the Gulf. My work was structural and technical, but I took the contract mostly for the profound, deep history the old relic of the Florida Roaring Twenties still radiated. The main issue was contained entirely inside the final section of the building, the old Olympic Grand Pool, a beautiful, immense, terrifyingly deep, Olympic-sized swimming facility that had been drained, entirely shut down, and permanently sealed for a full 5 decades due to multiple drowning incidents on site. My job was simple, full structural integrity inspection, all recorded by my body-mounted camera. I had a full 8 hours of isolated access, all under the cover of one of those intense, violent, high-humidity, chaotic summer rainstorms that make the interior of Florida feel perpetually wet, hot, and cold. The sound of the torrential rain battering the thick, high-vaulted glass ceiling of the vast, empty pool room was a deafening, constant sound that both soothed and terrified my focus. The initial terror was absolute silence. I rappelled down the internal scaffolding line a full 60 feet to the immense, perfectly dry, white concrete bottom of the vast, open pool facility, landing with a loud, ringing physical crunch that instantly echoed 300 times around the enormous concave ceiling. The massive space was dry, empty, immense, completely dominated by the singular, massive crack that ran the full vertical length of the deep-end tiling structure. I began my physical inspection, scanning the entire surface of the cracked, aging tiling with my high-output, wide-angle headlight beam. At the 5-hour mark, deep inside the physical void, staring down the long vertical split in the structure, I found what I was truly looking for, a small, entirely circular arch tunnel, roughly visible and sealed only by cheap, thick, white concrete infilling that was badly eroding into the deeper seam. Not geological. Not structural. Human-made. The final, terrifying realization of the last time I went diving was upon me immediately. Someone had created a deep-cut access point into either the main substructure tank or the external filtration system through the core of the immense facility's sealed environment. The terror was all local, all confined to this small, specific structure. I immediately attached my most sensitive audio array to the small, white, cement-filled archway, set the gain to max, and stepped back 50 feet, desperately waiting for an explanation. The speaker remained entirely silent for 10 whole minutes, amplifying only the immense acoustic pressure of the external chaotic rain. And then, a sound that completely destroyed the atmosphere of quiet, a complex, rapid, intensely loud, clear pang-pang-pang of a thick, wet, cold, human fist hammering constantly, methodically against the thin internal wall directly below the sealed section. The sound was frantic, terrified, and utterly focused, a simple, non-stop, desperate, rhythmic human plea for immediate, physical assistance. The pounding was immediately followed by a low, drawn-out sucking noise, the long, immense sound of someone, now trapped and fully exhausted, painfully attempting to compress the absolute final air supply from a massively drained, wet, cold medium. I screamed into the immense empty facility, demanding the full and immediate attention of any living soul. This wasn't a warning, it was a complex series of sounds that perfectly communicated the full, immediate, terrifying truth of intense, final human physical entrapment. I raced back to the emergency surface climb. The terrifying, organizing sound of the frantic manual drumming stopped completely, immediately replaced by a clear, final single voice that transmitted a powerful, single word through the air. Stay! The profound, guttural tone vibrated the immense cold steel of my harness. I tore the rappel line off its anchor point, scrambling in a frenzy up the wet scaffolding. As I ascended the long, dangerous climb, a massive, powerful, high-velocity wave of single, cold water suddenly roared from the center of the structure's cracked white-tiled floor, completely obliterating the exact spot where I had just been standing. The profound physical speed and volume of the single burst of freezing, dark liquid entirely bypassed the original split in the immense pool structure, forcing an immense, chaotic, sudden external pressure event on the final sealed facility. The final terror was clear. The entity was not trapped behind the concrete. It was physically trying to flood the empty structure, forcing its terrifying domain back onto the warm surface world, trying to bring me under its control. I burst the top emergency door lock with a terrifying physical violence and ran completely out of the complex and into the arms of the startled gate guard, completely abandoning the high-paying contract. I never spoke of the single, massive, intentional flooding event. The terrible, profound truth that almost killed me was uncovered only 2 years later, when the formal demolition contract revealed one precise, final, horrifying fact. The archway I found was not a tank access. It was the original entrance to a secret suite built under the old facility's deep end, permanently sealed when the hotel was foreclosed on. The room was found completely waterlogged, a human-sized coffin filled with cold, stagnant water. The entire massive section of the pool I was investigating was a perpetual, immense, human death machine, designed to lure all life in and convert its warmth into cold, stagnant water, preserving the final terror of the trapped souls forever. My final terror. The only final reason the powerful creature had demanded I remain inside the massive structure for the single event was so I could be the final, last living occupant that was simply physically drowned as a new, terrifying, sentient, powerful waterline for the immense, cold power to rise. Story 10. Back in the late 90s, before smartphones ruined true silence, the old, towering fire lookout post nestled high in the Payette National Forest in rural Idaho was one of the loneliest and most isolated jobs in America. 2 solid months of existential sensory deprivation. I'd taken it one summer for the escape. All you had was a small, 3-foot square, glass-walled cabin surrounded on all 4 sides by the wind, the clouds, and the complete, profound, consuming darkness of the high forest. The official mission was to watch for smoke plumes. My personal mission was to survive the crushing psychological stress of absolute isolation and the constant, overwhelming drumming of the sudden, aggressive rainstorms that swept the ranges after midnight. The only lifeline I had was light. The entire base of the tower was ringed by a high-intensity perimeter lighting system, constantly washing down the access staircase and the immediate metal foundation with a brilliant, comforting, steady stream of white sodium light. My terror began on a particularly miserable, completely silent, utterly black night. The power source for the massive structure was absolutely stable, the silent drone of the generators far below a reassuring hum. But the ring of lights, all 20 massive, high-powered yellow bulbs that defined my secure perimeter, suddenly failed. Perfectly, simultaneously, silently gone. Total, absolute, organized darkness descended, leaving the entire base of the tower in a deep, consuming blackness. There was no surge, no flickering light, no audible break in the main generator power down inside the cabin, just perfect, complete, hostile dark. I immediately grabbed my emergency short-range radio to check the backup system, frantically trying to communicate the massive, singular failure. All I heard was the internal static and the frantic, high-pitched thrum of my own rapid breathing inside the small, enclosed operating cabin. The fear of deep, sudden vulnerability was paralyzing. The sound that followed from the metal base of the tower confirmed immediately that the power loss was deliberate. From the massive, cold, cylindrical, vibrating steel base of the structure directly below my glass-walled cabin, a precise, faint, organized scarystories click sound began, a subtle, but mechanical friction no human should be able to make. It was the clear, rhythmic sound of a full, heavy metal latch being slowly, meticulously, and fully drawn back off a locked metal door below, followed by the soft, high-pitched, slow creak of the immense, vertical maintenance hatch being smoothly, painfully pulled open. The slow, intentional manipulation of the immense, sound-dampened machinery came from the absolute core of the massive isolation zone. Something massive had ascended directly to my point of isolation now just to announce its presence. I froze. I didn't dare turn my high beam on the room below. Through 2 minutes of complete, terrified silence, the humidity around me seemed to thicken, intensifying the cold of the external rain. A single, profound, terrifying sound came from directly inside the intercom pipe right next to my left ear, a short, clear, sustained burst of pressurized steam, followed quickly by a man's voice, deep, professional, and slightly irritated, the exact tone a tired man would use to talk to a supervisor 20 miles away. There was no direct language, only the tone of aggressive, immediate frustration, and then silence. The sound that followed from the metal base of the tower confirmed immediately that the power loss was deliberate. The frightening sound that persisted was not human. From the massive, cold, cylindrical, vibrating steel base of the structure directly below my glass-walled cabin, a precise, faint, organized scarystories click sound began, a subtle, but mechanical friction no human should be able to make. The methodical, constant click noise was absorbed now and replaced by the single terrifying, persistent, rhythmic, small tapping noise that entirely consumed my singular remaining concentration. I had been told that the tower had been an experiment in isolation, a permanent structure dedicated to long-term vigilance. As I waited in the cold darkness of the high cube, the subtle sound was now amplified inside my own structure, a rhythmic, soft, immense, organized, continuous tapping on the exterior glass on the left-hand outer window. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was slow, persistent, deliberate, completely defying the immense horizontal winds that were battering the far side of the tower. I realized with a sudden, freezing chill that the tapping was only sounding when I had turned my light source away from the immediate vertical threat. I threw the light suddenly to the left, bathing the window in full, eye-cracking white light. Nothing. Only slick, wet glass and immense, profound isolation. I spun completely back around to the first threat, the open doorway, and the second, terrifying surprise hit me, the entire ring of security perimeter lights. All 20 massive yellow bulbs, abruptly flared to life. A simultaneous, precise, immense flash of full, blinding, integrated yellow light that had no discernible source of power, but perfectly consumed the total blackness around the base of the entire structure in a blinding, terrifyingly organized burst of sheer optical intensity. 10 full seconds of painful light continued before the colossal structural failure instantly consumed the entire electrical supply. The entire array failed immediately and permanently. A loud, rhythmic stream of Zapop, WHINE, came over the internal speaker, followed by the immediate, final, total, absolute, eternal darkness. I screamed and collapsed into the center of my floor, curled up beside the massive, dead control panel. I finally understood the terror of Watchtower Lightout. This wasn't an organic monster. It was a massive, concentrated, sentient presence of organized darkness, a literal physical manifestation of the infinite void surrounding me, determined and capable of consuming any external light source that dared to challenge its permanent domain. The terrifying tapping sound was its way of distracting me, while its massive physical form reached out from the darkness of the high fog to seize and physically manipulate the power grid at the base of my tower. The immediate, coordinated, full-blown, final blast of light was its singular, frightening, single message. It had consumed, mastered, and completely annihilated my only lifeline and was a permanent, massive part of the dark structure now. I bailed off the post at 5 a.m., using the emergency rope line to rappel down the wet, freezing tower base and immediately fleeing my post entirely, never climbing another isolated staircase in my entire life. The final terror. I realized the entire mountain base was fully consumed by the pure, terrifying, organized absence of external human light, waiting for me to turn off my flashlight one final time, confirming its absolute final, total power. Story 11. The old house was built without the owner understanding the point of basements. They had dug perhaps 7 feet down, just enough to get past the frost line of the soil, poured a foundation, and stopped right there. This gave us about 4 feet of usable underground space, which my younger brother, Dale, immediately claimed as an apartment when our family moved to a small town in rural Indiana when I was 16. It was less an apartment and more a shallow, damp, semi-finished bunker for a 17-year-old high school kid who hated his parents. Our small, ordinary American house, split level, 3 beds, 2 baths, quickly had a strange, separate identity when it came to Dale. He'd sleep, eat, and breathe down there, only coming up for a stale hamburger patty or a mandatory Sunday dinner. I didn't question it. We were brothers, 2 years apart, and that meant we were permanently dedicated to ignoring each other. But in the spring of '96, the basement started changing my brother, or maybe something down below started wearing my brother as a temporary skin suit. It began subtly, like all the worst terrors do. Dale started losing weight. Not like a teenager naturally thins out, it was gaunt. His cheekbones jutted out from his face in a way they never had before, and his eyes, brown and intense, retreated into deep, charcoal rings from what I assumed was his chronic lack of sleep, likely due to terrible gaming habits. He started spending 36-hour stretches down there without coming up for food, and when I, out of morbid fraternal curiosity, once asked him to come up for a movie night, he refused with a strained, rattling cough that sounded too harsh for someone his age. The other thing was the language. Dale majored in minimum effort, not linguistics. But he started mumbling when he slept now, audible through the cheap HVAC vent that shared the main floor bedroom to his cellar space. It began with unintelligible whispers, usually a soft clicking or scraping noise, then slowly transitioned into recognizable cadence, but not recognizable words. It sounded like an awful, guttural form of Latin, maybe, a series of hard G's and rolling R's separated by sharp, barking expirations. When our mom finally heard it one Tuesday morning, loud enough from her spot at the kitchen table, she just nervously called it stressful puberty and loud music causing auditory confusion, which was the family's main way of handling a crisis. Dad, a retired Marine who only communicated in commands, just told Dale to take some aspirin and to stop bothering his mother. And Dale listened, but only in the most terrifying way. Dale finally stopped talking. His appearances became unsettling. When he came up for those required Sunday dinners, he had no presence. He walked right past us without acknowledging anyone, stood at the kitchen counter staring at the wood grain for 10 minutes, then helped himself to an alarming amount of red meat and bread, and took it back down to his bunker, slamming the low basement door with an authority he surely hadn't owned 3 months prior. His hands were shaking all the time, a rapid, low-amplitude tremor that he didn't even notice. And when he spoke back to my dad, an event which had rarely failed to create a 10-hour shouting match with heavy sanctions, he didn't sound like Dale. Dad once asked him to change his oil for the old Ford sedan, a standard chore. Dale responded with a low, smooth voice, completely devoid of teenage irritation and angst, saying in an echoingly placid tone, "We are considering your imposition upon our schedule." My dad just stopped slicing the chicken and stared into the air, as still and white as the snow outside. He never asked Dale to do a chore again. But it got worse. The things coming from the basement tenant, as I started to subconsciously call it, began to mimic my father. My father had a distinct, deep, basso-speaking style, a way of enunciating that projected authority and a residual military toughness. My dad, in his mid-50s at the time, also suffered from a lifelong smoking habit that made his true voice slightly more ragged when he was tired. One night, around 2 in the morning, which was my prime slot for video games, I swore I heard my dad moving around downstairs, walking his specific, heavy gait on the wood floor. He was speaking, too, talking about the furnace suddenly breaking. I was already too tired for this. I grabbed an old blanket and padded to the top of the stairs, ready to tell him I'd look at the furnace in the morning. When I reached the small, dark landing, bathed only in the distant street light glow through the window, I heard the voice clearly coming from the bottom of the basement stairs right below me. It was Dad's voice, too clear, a perfect copy of his tone and bass. The only thing wrong was one crucial detail. It was my dad's voice before the smoking had taken hold. It was the smooth, strong, unwavering command of a 40-year-old Marine captain, but talking with a dry, cracked, unnatural repetition. "We need to acquire the heat for her lord." Pause. Heat. Lord. Below. I froze instantly. My real father was easily audible snoring, loudly but rhythmically, from the master bedroom directly down the hall. I stood absolutely still, my knuckles white on the flimsy wooden banister. The low, imitation father voice repeated the sentence again, this time adding a bizarre, wet chirping sound at the end, as if the imitation was straining at the boundary of what could be imitated. It went quiet. Then came the sound that solidified everything inside my 18-year-old brain, the rattling, metallic sound of the shallow basement door opening, slowly, creak by agonizing creak. Whatever was down there, whatever had been talking to itself, learning to speak in broken Latin, and then adapting the tone of my Marine father, was now coming up, leaving the confines of the basement tenant for the quiet, dark space of the main house. I stumbled back, not running, but crawling backward along the carpet, desperately trying not to make a noise that would indicate my presence at the top of the stairs. As I reached the doorway to my room, I saw it. The hallway was empty. The sound of my own lock and bolt on my door was louder than everything else, louder than the incessant, rhythmic sound of the cold, constant rainstorm and the silence of the rest of the house. I sat against the door, holding my breath, staring at the weak light filtering in from the window. Minutes bled away. I heard a noise that sounded like a very fine, dry scratching, an insect perhaps, which quickly grew into a sound more unsettling than the walking I had avoided. It was quiet, repetitive, metallic tapping. Ping, ping, ping. Then, the profound sound was right outside my door, in the hall. It sounded like small, cold fingernails tapping, not on the wood, but on the metal strike plate of the door frame itself. And then the voice began again. My dad's pre-smoking voice. Only this time, it was distorted, slowed down. Syllables stretched into an echoing horror and punctuated by heavy, wet swapping sounds of breath. Swapping sound. Are you hiding, son? Swapping sound. Your brother has been a good tenant. Swapping sound. The terrifying thing was the attempt at empathy or parental concern, a grotesque effort to convince me that the physical world was entire lies. The sudden, wet swapping, the sound of thick mucus or something even worse moving inside the vocal cords, confirmed my suspicions about the entire demonic entity's utter, unhuman nature. I stayed silent, frozen in the corner of my room, completely still until the sun broke the horizon, ignoring the cold sweat that I was drenched in. When the early autumn sun finally peeked through the window pane, bringing with it a sliver of normalcy and light, the tapping stopped. The shuffling, wet sounds in the hallway stopped. When I finally found the courage to open the door, hours later, the hall was completely empty, silent, and smelling faintly of ozone and something intensely like crushed mothballs. I looked down the small stairwell to the basement. Dale's door was shut, securely bolted. I listened. Nothing. Just an ordinary, quiet house on a Tuesday morning. I went to the kitchen. My real father was at the table, loudly coughing, reading the finance section of the newspaper. A huge thermos of black coffee sitting next to him. Dad never once mentioned the structural voice I had heard. Dale finally emerged for breakfast, hours later. He looked just as malnourished as he had the other times. As he reached past me for the toaster, a sudden movement made me look down. His right forearm. Just below the short sleeve of his shirt, there was a raised mark on the skin that looked strangely like dried ink or a brand. I didn't know what I was looking at. Maybe a small burn. But the image was clear enough to send a knife-sharp chill down my spine. The mark was a perfect circle, about the size of a quarter. Embedded in its center, a swirling, complex set of lines, barely visible, but strikingly precise. I reached out instinctively to rub the skin. He flinched away from my touch. His eyes, once soft brown, were now pitch black and intense. His pupils were not small. They were unnaturally large, like black wells swallowing his original color entirely. Then, his face did something worse than stare blankly at me, a rapid, grotesque mimicry of a friendly smile, a series of complex muscles flexing and rippling, ending in a perfectly straight, uncanny line. I froze in place with physical horror. Years later, Dale had fully recovered. He was healthy, finished college, and took a job at an IT firm in Silicon Valley. He never mentioned the basement tenant to me, but I didn't need him to. The truth wasn't in his words, but in the silence. Because every time my real father had a severe coughing fit, the kind that racked his body, Dale would stop what he was doing, wherever he was, and look directly at me with that unnatural, black-eyed intensity, a silent challenge in the void of his pupils. I finally understood it all. The possession hadn't been thrown out, it had only been temporarily housed, borrowing the voice, learning the man, and waiting for its moment to claim him in full. The basement tenant wasn't a temporary resident. He had paid us a long, terrible visit, and I knew for certain that sooner or later, as the decades passed, that imitation of my father's voice would become perfect, and I would be left wondering who was sitting at the breakfast table, my single sense of family integrity permanently destroyed by the organized, demonic attack. Story 12. I was assigned to a specialized environmental task force doing structural integrity audits on massive, condemned industrial sites. My last terrifying contract was in a sprawling, multi-story chemical processing facility on a now-abandoned river island near Erie, Pennsylvania. The terrifying unit, a huge, multi-leveled structure built entirely from cold, black, immense brick and steel, had been permanently decommissioned for 3 decades after a massive cyanide leak, leaving it a corrosive shell filled with immense, unmoving, organized filth. My job was straightforward, alone, midnight to 6 a.m., full survey of all top-floor stress points and water pooling, battling a constant, aggressive rainstorm that never seemed to let up, turning the entire exterior complex into a slick, massive, wet landscape. The building felt cold, deeply corrupt, and immensely hostile to my single presence. The entire air inside the structure was permanently permeated with the strong, metallic stench of deep rust, concentrated industrial bleach, and ancient, bitter, sour methane gas. The profound, physical sound of the violent rain hammering the top of the uninsulated building was overwhelming, a sheer acoustic wall of white sound that completely submerged any potential sound coming from the dead, immense structure. My initial terror was visual. On the top floor, an immense, 2-acre expanse of cold, cracked concrete, huge, stagnant pools of freezing, black, completely unmoving water had collected. The still black was entirely unnatural in its deep, immense, uniform absence of any external reflection. As I moved my high-power spotlight over the surface of the vast, black pool, I saw 2 simple, terrifying things. First, the large, slow, continuous spread of a thick, oily, immensely dark black muck, a viscous, non-waterborne fluid slowly spreading outward across the pool surface, completely defying gravity and structural cohesion. And second, the precise absence of the immense overhead structure's visible reflection in the deep, uniform, terrifyingly black surface of the water should completely reflect the building. My internal assumption was that the old building's appetite was actively feeding on the visual component of the water. I immediately began a full isolation survey, desperate to map the contamination source. I was walking the far east perimeter, 10 feet from the contamination event, staring at the black, immense, silent liquid, when the final, paralyzing event began. The dark, viscous blackness that was spreading across the water suddenly, intensely, incredibly tilted. The huge film became an active, vertical wall of dark, oily substance, rearing vertically for a full 10 feet, pulling the entire pool volume sideways to create a single, sheer, vertical surface, fully separated from the immense, wet concrete floor. The vertical liquid wall formed a terrifyingly immense, perfect, fluid, thick reflection of a man's torso and head, a colossal, amorphous, moving, dark, liquid column of pure negative energy. My internal fear screamed the terrible logic. The physical energy of the plant was not feeding on the structural component of the water. It was actively feeding by recreating the immense physical, wet body of its final human victim, a massive, black, oily giant that was now standing a clean, complete, immense 40 feet away from my frozen body. The terrifying event was entirely silent. The massive, black, liquid body then performed one final, precise, agonizing, physical action. It reached out an immense, thick, oily liquid arm, stretching a frightening 50 absolute feet across the immense, slick, cold wet floor, and perfectly positioned the huge, liquid hand right over the center of the massive, structural crack in the center of the floor, creating a disturbing, profound, liquid, black contact. The enormous hand pressed down hard. The entire vast space was silent. Then, immediately, the thick, palpable, organizing sound of an enormous, high-pressure, physical suction began, a continuous, deafening, horrific audible slurp that instantly dominated the chaotic sound of the exterior storm. The entire volume of liquid in the colossal reflection began to immediately drain, not down the structural drain, but back into the crack itself, being consumed by the sheer suction power of the absolute negative pressure. I screamed and fled the entire complex, scrambling high out of the total exposure, running for the temporary gate guard shack a mile away in total terror. I did not stop for the survey gear, the paperwork, the contract money, or the cold, wet reality of my own fear. I left the entire enormous, dark chemical processing complex to its final, terrible end. The final audit found nothing, except a profound, utterly shocking increase in the overall internal humidity of the complex, due to a massive, unexplained structural water displacement that ran in chaotic linear lines along the floor of the massive complex. The final, terrible, physical truth of the old building's appetite was simple, terrifying, and profound. The ancient power source of the corrupt structure was actively creating its own immense, viscous, silent, terrifying demonic messenger body out of the single essential elements around it. And the final terrifying action was to simply consume all the complex's entire history of filth and liquid waste back into the core earth. My terrifying flight was to interrupt the entire massive, single effort. The ultimate terror was the sheer visual proof that the massive, physical, organized corruption was now entirely conscious of its terrible, complete final form. Story 13. Working nights at the small, antique Coast Guard radio tower near Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, meant total physical isolation, a solitary, 3-story cement monolith isolated on a massive, deserted granite cliff, the land around it completely swallowed by coastal erosion. You were entirely alone, your life reduced to the slow, intense work of signal tracing and logging ambient airwaves. The worst atmospheric condition was not the immense heat, but the cold, heavy, continuous, non-stop Atlantic storm, which completely obliterated visual reality with immense sheets of horizontal, chaotic rain and thick, wet sea fog. My single lifeline, the core truth of my existence, was the old, vast, powerful, permanent set of UHF, VHF, and HF radios, my silent, constant, acoustic link to the turbulent world miles from my post. Everything else outside the immense static, and the high thrumming of the high wind on the array, and the raw sound of the storm was completely silenced. It was 4:15 a.m. on a terrifying, complete, blackout night. The sound of the external storm was simply enormous, a continuous, deafening, white roar of intense wind and driving, horizontal, aggressive water. I was logging ambient acoustic noise on the abandoned commercial aircraft signal frequency when the phenomenon returned. The speaker, the old, insulated main radio speaker, did not emit static. It emitted a clear, high-pitched, single, intense voice, entirely male, absolutely controlled, and completely consumed by absolute, pure, organized terror. The voice was yelling one single, concise, professional distress call. Mayday! Mayday! This is the Andrea D. Our compass is fixed and frozen. We are going down. Please give me a read on the shore lights now. The single sentence was repeated twice, precisely, first in a calm, desperate bass tone, then a second repetition that ended in a massive, terrifyingly fractured, sobbing high-pitched whine. Then, the immense, loud, clear signal completely cut out. The line, dead silent and empty, remained entirely static-free. I was paralyzed by the single, clear signal. But the extreme panic of the empty Coast Guard radio was a unique physiological attack. I immediately knew the call. The Andrea D. was a small, high-profile fishing dory that was lost with all hands, fully capsizing at sea, fully 40 years ago, a massive regional fishing trauma that was taught in all the base marine safety procedure classes. The call I just heard was the last, unacknowledged distress call the local region had attempted to retrieve decades ago. The line was now permanently active and real again. The terrifying signal returned, unprompted, 4 minutes later. Not as a distress call, but as a silent, immediate, pure, high-intensity EMF pulse, a clear, rhythmic, massive electromagnetic surge completely filling the tower with audible white noise. The vast digital array all around my post was immediately disabled by the single focused energy wave. And the terrifying, rhythmic surge was simply replaced by a profound, terrifying, ratting sound that permeated the entire sound field, the high-pitched, incredibly delicate, organized rhythmic clacking of glass and metal objects being gently knocked together over and over again on the main exterior aluminum table 50 feet below me, the objects being organized entirely by a single set of non-human will. The source was entirely isolated, controlled, and intensely precise, entirely focused on causing acoustic torture. I fled the quiet radio bank, running completely out onto the exposed section of the high-structure platform, fighting the dense, chaotic wind and rain to see the scene below. I swept my high-intensity light on the black-painted metal table 50 feet below. The table was full of objects, rusty wrenches, small steel cans, discarded glass coffee mugs, entire piles of metal components, all completely thrown and disorganized by the fierce external storm. But I saw the source of the incredible, loud noise. Right on the center of the massive, cold, wet table, a small, white, antique, thin bone fragment, a single human digit, was slowly, precisely knocking itself against a single, empty, aluminum beer can. The contact was slow, organized, non-magnetic, and intentional. The immense sonic power was generated not by the materials, but by the entity's complete, absolute, powerful mental will to generate noise from the single clean, white fragment. I retreated entirely. I called the supervisor 10 minutes later and filed for an immediate, absolute structural failure audit on the electrical system. The final audit found nothing wrong with my massive antennae array. But the simple, massive, physical truth was recorded in the single, written, final note that my cleaning crew logged that evening on the top deck. A small, clean, white human finger bone was lying perfectly dry and completely untouched in the absolute geometrical center of the single metallic table, entirely isolated from the wetness of the chaotic environment. The object was removed by police for a simple forensic review. I immediately resigned and never returned to the sound frequency world of Coast Guard watches. The empty Coast Guard radio was not calling for help to the world of the living. The vast, turbulent high-frequency network, combined with the dense atmospheric chaos of the aggressive cold storm, had instead become a powerful acoustic medium for the trapped dead passengers. The ultimate terror was simple. The massive network was actively broadcasting the complete, final, terrifying emotional trauma of their absolute death sequence to the single living listener, demanding that I become a permanent witness to their complete final panic and their single moment of eternal pain.